Hello and welcome to our webinar, The Circular Economy and Leather, hosted by International Leather Maker and in association with raw materials pricing website, The Sour Report. My name is Isabella Griffiths. I am the editor of ILM, the leading leather industry business information brand. I would like to acknowledge our webinar sponsor, Stahl, and Michael Costello, Director of Sustainability at Stahl, will be one of the presenters today. Today's webinar will tackle what is arguably one of the hottest and most debated topics within the leather industry, the circular economy, which is an important consideration for operators across the entire leather supply chain. Today, we have three different presenters from different parts of the industry offering new ideas and perspectives on the subject. Before I hand over today's webinar to our speakers, I would like to give a brief introduction to International Leather Maker. ILM was established in 2013 to fill a gap in the market for a media business that served the leather industry across several new media platforms as well as print. ILM covers the global leather supply chain and is also published twice a year in Mandarin. The website, internationalleathermaker.com, is updated several times daily with the latest industry news, views, and information. Founded in 1985, The Sour Report is an online raw materials pricing, analysis, and trends website, which is updated daily from a network of sources from around the world for its paid subscribers. It is a useful source of market information for the whole leather supply chain, including traders, tanners, brands and retailers, and associated suppliers. I would now like to introduce our three presenters. The first presentation will be made by Michael Costello, Director of Sustainability at Stahl, who will present the circular economy, how leather is rising to the challenge. The second presentation will be by Fabiana Orlandi, Environmental and Sustainability Specialist at UNIC, the Italian Tanners Association, who will give an outline of tanning and leather in Italy as an example of excellence in the circular economy. The third presentation is by Karl Flowers, Technical Director of Authenticae, who will present leather and the circular bioeconomy. I will now hand over the webinar to our first presenter, Michael Costello, Director of Sustainability, Stahl.
Hello, good morning everybody. My name is Michael Costello from Stahl, and I'm here to talk about the circular economy and how the leather industry is rising to the challenge and how it is reacting to this not new concept of circular economy, but something that I believe will be very important for the industry in the future to align itself. So if we look at the agenda, I'll talk a little bit about the circular economy in general, what it means. I think many of you will know this, but it's always good to remind ourselves what it actually means. And then we'll get into exactly what circularity means already and could mean for leather in the future. That's leather manufacturing and, of course, leather as a material. And then we'll close with a what-if scenario. What if we could indeed move even more in this direction of circularity for the leather industry, and some of the things that we'd have to do to reach that goal of circularity in this industry. So I think the first statement I'm going to put up, with apologies to economists who are listening, I think it's quite clear that if we have a world that is finite, then we cannot just keep taking resources from it at an exponential rate and expect that that can be continued. Again, apologies to the economists. It's just a funny statement, but actually it's quite a serious statement, and it's quite obvious that we cannot go on in the way that we're doing things if we want to be sustainable. And of course, since the Industrial Revolution, that is the way that we have been working in most cases in our economies. Basically, we're talking about a linear economy system, which we have now, where resources are extracted, products are produced, distributed and consumed, and for the most part wasted. And this is the linear economy, which is not sustainable. If we were able to switch that to a circular economy where resources are taken from the earth and are able to be consumed and then reused or repaired or recycled or indeed reintroduced back into the environment in a way that no waste was generated, then this would be the true circular economy. This is not a new idea, of course. Nature itself works in this way. If you think of plants and trees where fruit and leaves are produced, consumed by animals or by the earth beneath them, and completely redistributed and reintroduced back into the soil and the ground in order to produce more trees. So that's the ideal system that we'd like to move to in our industrial world, which has not been the case for several hundred years, of course. The reality is that we're somewhere in between this. There is a recycling economy. There is some awareness of this circularity that's required, but we're still very early in the recycling economy. For example, plastics, a very small amount of plastics are actually recycled and reused. Other products, similar. So the idea here is to move from linear to circular in order to sustain the world. One of the gurus of this modern concept of circular economy, which of course is just framed in a modern way because it's based on a very basic old system of circularity, was this gentleman called Walter Stahl. No relation to Stahl, by the way, he's Walter Stahl. And his famous advice from his groundbreaking work was that if we can reuse what we can, recycle what cannot be reused, repair what is broken, and remanufacture what cannot be repaired, then we have a chance to live in a more sustainable world. And one of the important points there is repair, which I think lends itself very well to the leather world. And that's where we can get into the discussion now about circularity for leather as a material, but also in the way that it's manufactured. And of course, as we know, the design of the leather and the leather goods is critical for this. Leather is a long-lasting material by definition, and it can be repaired. This is one of the great properties of leather that everybody knows and loves. A little bit like wine, it gets better with time, and it can be repaired to make it look really good after 10, 15, 20, even more years. This is one of its great characteristics, which lends itself very well to this story of circularity. And we'll see that a little bit later. But the ability to repair any material like leather depends on the design of that material, but also on the design of the article or the garment in particular. And the ability to separate materials from modern articles like shoes, garments, and seats is the greatest difficulty when it comes to the recycling or indeed biodegradation of many materials. How do you separate them from each other in these complicated products that we have designed for ourselves? So zips, stitching, glues are often the failure points in this. But as a process, when you're actually processing leather, there are already many features in that process which are considered to be circular. And we'll look at that in the next slide. Because leather, actually for many years, it has been working on this. It may not have been called the circular economy, but because there's good economic benefit and it makes commercial sense to generate less waste and to reuse any waste that you generate, the leather industry has in fact been quite forward thinking in terms of how it can manage its waste. And there was one very interesting case study that I found, and I have permission from the author who was studying in Spain at the time, is about how the benefits of a circular model measured using life cycle assessment in a tanning cluster, in this case in Italy, how those benefits could be measured and could be made into numbers that you can actually report in a scientific way. So what he did is he looked at a particular tanning cluster and took into account the best case scenario where circular methods were employed during that leather process. So for example, the wastewater and the sludge were sent to construction and fertilizer industries for use in those industries. So there was no waste from those. The chromium recovery plant, which is actually a standard procedure already in Italy, the chromium could be reused in the tanning cluster itself. So again, employing a circular method in that tannery cluster, in this particular case, chromium recovery. And of course, tannery shavings and fleshings and cuttings that happen in the production of leather, in this particular case, were recovered and reused in different types of applications. So he took the best case of all of this circularity methods and calculated the environmental footprint reduction using those methods versus not using those methods or using traditional standard methods. And he plotted those using the life cycle assessment methodology. and found indeed that there was significant improvements in the categories of environmental footprint impact for carbon dioxide, for eutrophication, acidification. So it was just a scientific way to prove that circularity is not just intuitively a good thing to do, it also actually makes a difference when you calculate the environmental impact of a process using a scientific and generally accepted methodology like life cycle assessment. Another nice example from this, and I don't want to promote any particular company during the presentation, but this one is quite well known, in this case from the Scottish Leather Group. And they found a way several years ago to convert waste from their production process. They are a tannery, so they were converting the waste generated from their process into thermal energy. They were able to do this by converting their waste, the sludge, into gas and steam and redirect that energy back into their process. A really nice example of quite an innovative way of using circularity to actually save money for themselves. I think it was a significant investment, but they're able to save energy, waste, and really have a nice circular system within their own factory. But what about longevity? We spoke about this, how leather by its nature lends itself to the circular economy because of its longevity. And I have this quotation that we received from a famous shoe brand, which I think is quite interesting to consider. And what he's saying here is that a pair of shoes that is made from a material that lasts twice as long as an alternative material, let's say a material like leather is lasting for 10 years, and there's an alternative material that only lasts for 5 years, then the environmental impact of the long-lasting material is about half. So if something lasts for a long time, it has a much less environmental impact. Why? Because you don't need to remake it. You don't need to make 2 pairs of shoes in 10 years instead of 1 pair. And that basically doubles your environmental impact. So I think that's an important aspect when it comes to leather to consider, that long lasting is a good thing for the environment. And it also looks good. And if you can repair something, it can have a certain value added nature to it also. So finally, I'd like to close with a what if, thinking of the future. I think we have to assume that, okay, maybe exponential growth is not possible into the future, but we also cannot accept a zero growth industrial model simply because the population is increasing in the world. And whether we like it or not, we will need more meat and leather for that population. So how could we employ a circular model for leather making that could fit into that not zero growth industrial model, but a growing industrial model where we can serve and feed our communities? What we could think of, for example, is what if leather could be designed with built-in compostable features? What that means is that somehow at the end of the life of the leather, there was some magic switch or something that could be triggered where the material becomes completely compostable. Yeah? Now, leather already is quite degradable compared to many materials, depending on how it is treated. But what I'm saying here is that there could be some special compostable features that could accelerate that degradation at a certain time with a trigger. And what if during the manufacture of the leather, and indeed during the leather's life, we were able to maintain the circularity that we mentioned earlier, reusing the floats during the process, not having any waste in sludge or shavings or trimmings? We were able to use those in other industries perhaps. Maximizing the cutting yields would also help. And of course, repairing and reusing the final articles for much longer than they currently are done. So what if we could make the life of leather during its process and manufacture stable and circular in this way? And then at the end of life, if leather was easily separable from the other components in the shoe or in the garment or in the seat, then we believe it can be degraded. Leather already has many degradable features depending on how it's treated and how it's finished. It can be composted and degraded depending on the conditions also. But if it could be separated from the other components, that is the most critical question here, which is also one of the more complex ones. And then once it's separated, it could be potentially reintroduced into the environment if it had these built-in compostable features. And of course, as a last resort, disposal would be the last resort. The whole idea of this is that there is no waste, but certainly we don't have a magic solution for no waste, but I think we have many solutions that can reduce waste significantly to make disposal only as a last resort. So what if we could include these features and this circularity in the manufacture of leather? Then I think we would be well on the way to an acceptable circular model that could accommodate the growth in population and the growth in the industry that will be needed in order to sustain the future. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Michael, for such an interesting presentation. I will now hand over the webinar to our second presenter, Fabiana Orlandi from UNIC.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Fabiana Orlandi. I'm in charge of UNIC Environmental Department, and today I'm going to share with you the circular practices of the Italian tanning sector. UNIC is the Italian Tanners Association and represents an industrial sector who is leader in Europe and in the world, with a share of 65% of production value in Europe and 22% in value of the world production. UNIC is member of COTANS, the European Confederation of Tanners, and ICT, the International Council of Tanners. But now let's move on circular economy. What is this? Circular economy is a new paradigm for the economic growth, which aim is to maintain as long as possible materials in the productive and using circle, avoiding the use of non-renewable resources. Pragmatically, we can translate the circularity in three key elements: reducing use of resources, recycling, and reusing. Let's move on the first point, reducing consumption. Italian tanneries have long been committed to reducing consumption of resources through the ongoing improvement of processes, the application of GMPs, the use of renewable energy, and also the use of materials already part of production cycles, such as byproducts, recycled products, and recovered products, of course, whenever it is possible. Results now compared to 10 years ago in terms of resources consumption. Less 16% of water used, less 7.7% of energy. Significant positive trends are tangible also for use of chemicals, CO2 emissions, and waste production. In addition, we can declare excellent performances of central wastewater treatment plants, and thanks to the environmental service companies, the recovered wastes account for the 73% of the total waste. Let's now talk about recovering. Tanneries use byproducts from other production sectors, such as food and others. Furthermore, they produce wastes and scraps that become raw material for the other industrial sectors, contributing to the reduction of resource consumption. In the detail, tanneries are circular by purpose. They transform a byproduct of food industry. Also, some chemicals used in the tanning industry are byproducts of other production processes. It is the case of fat liquors, degreasers, chromium salts, tannins, some enzymes, polymers, and casein, and so on. Scraps from tanning production processes become raw materials for other industrial sectors. It is the case, for example, of byproducts from liming process, such as fleshing and trimmings, that are rich of natural proteins of collagen. They are broken down in collagenase peptides for the production of gelatins used in a variety of applications. We can see in the picture some examples of food industry, pharmaceuticals, and nutraceutics application. But it is also the case of other applications more or less well known, from shavings or scraps of finished leather, such as bonded leather, non-woven fabric or extrusion, and also paper. The organic nature and the chemical composition of some leather scraps makes possible to process them to obtain agricultural additives such as fertilizers and biostimulants. but also materials for other applications, for example, additive and retardant for plaster. The Italian tanning sector strongly believes in circular economy as a driving force of economic growth for its future. For this reason, UNIC is supporting the transition towards circular economy by investing through Linea Pelle in SICIT shares. SICIT is one of the main actors in developing circular economy in tanning sector, also in other countries. With regards to recycling, it is possible to extract chromium salts from discarded tanning bath liquids and reuse them as tanning agent. Furthermore, some tanneries are implementing the use of recycling water, both from internal and external processes. And last but not least, it is possible to value wastes such as sludges from wastewater treatment plants. They can be transformed into fertilizers or into building materials after a high temperature process. They can also be treated with thermocatalytic pyrolysis with or without oxygen to produce bio-oil, fuel, and thermal energy. Finally, what about circular reusing of leather? Leather is a natural but also durable material. So leather articles can be reused second-hand, can be repaired, and leather material can be reprocessed, recovered by unsold leather articles or from end-of-life articles. In the picture, we can see some examples: earrings, key holders, bags from seat covers of trains and airplanes, covers of electronic devices. So, at what point are we in the implementation of circular economy? Well represented on the left by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's graph. We have reported on the right the elements of circularity of the Italian tanning industry. We can see that we are at a very good point to close the loop of organic and renewable materials, here represented by the green lines. There is still work to be done for valuing leather scraps, reusing leather articles and leather materials at the end of the life of articles. But to do that, it is necessary to rethink habits of use and consumption of goods, and not less important, involve the entire value chain and governments in managing end-of-life products. In conclusion, what is the contribution of the Italian leather industry to the circular economy? Offer to market and consumers valued and precious, but also renewable materials, transform a byproduct of food industry in a durable material. It avoids the disposal and the destruction of a scrap that may be generated in any case, valuing and creating the conditions to maintaining it in the cycle of finished materials. Develop an effective industrial symbiosis aimed to recover waste and scraps generated by its production and services processes. Invest on solutions to promote circular economy. Example of this is an exhibition area dedicated to circular economy in the tanning sector that was set up at the last edition of Linea Pelle to emphasize to visitors the fact that the tanning industry uses a byproduct of food industry. The area also explains some of the processes that are part of the Italian tanning sectors. The Italian tanning industry is working strongly, not only to avoid harm, but also to be a part of the solution by contributing to global sustainable development and circular economy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Fabiana. This has provided some great insights. I will now hand over the webinar to our third presenter, Karl Flowers of Authenticae.
Thanks, ILM, for inviting me to talk a little bit about the circular economy. The talk today is quite short, but what we're going to try and do is give a little bit of background to what the circular economy means. And I want to advance the discussion a little bit further and actually talk about something that's really trending in environmental circles at the moment, something called the circular bioeconomy, which many environmentalists think is the next stage beyond the circular economy. Leather is a material that will be able to fit into the circular bioeconomy quite well. And that's what I'm going to go through today, is just trying to outline what those definitions mean and exactly how leather does that. A lot of the definitions that I'm going to use today actually come from the EU's document, the Circular Economy Strategy, and the related flow topics that was published in 2014, 2015. So if listeners are interested in where I get my diagrams and where I get my definitions from, that's the document to look for. So we first of all have to understand where most of the economy actually sits at the moment, and that is in the actual linear economy. And if you can look at the slide, you'll be able to see that the linear economy is, as the name suggests, going from where you take resources and put them through some kind of making or production process. There's the use by the user in their day-to-day operations. And then, of course, at some point in its life, it ends up in the bin. And on the right-hand side, you have this overflowing bin. Critics of this linear economy will say that it's very resource intensive. And, of course, it generates enormous amounts of waste, which means that long-term, this kind of economy is completely unsustainable. A lot of leather falls in this particular category, and this diagram came from one of the articles that we ran in ILM some time back now. But above the line, you can see something which we call use active. This is what we call the Technosphere, where humans are technically using products. And below the line is what we call the biosphere, where ultimately things will go through some kind of degradation. And I'll clarify what I mean by degradation a little bit later. But what you can sort of see is the dotted line, a product goes into use, it's used for a while, then it gets disused, sits for a while, and then gets placed into the biosphere or into a waste dump, and over time it changes, it's lost. So that's pretty much what the linear economy does there. You could extend things. Some people think this is a little bit better sustainability-wise. Now you could take something like a car seat, place it through one cycle, then upcycle it into a handbag, cut it up again, put it into a key ring or some kind of little key tab or something. And then, of course, ultimately that gets thrown away into disuse and goes into the biosphere. You know, you can see that part of this linear model is that occasionally some of the black arrows do enter back into the biosphere. You get waste as you're upcycling, and ultimately everything ends up in the biosphere. Still quite a linear model, but there's an element of upcycling, which has to be a good thing. The other type of linear model, and there's many proponents in the EU who look at this to being something that is a little bit easier to handle compared to a straight wasteful linear model, and that is that you use your products once and then you place them into recovery of energy or gas. You can see there that there's a flow of materials. There's obviously materials that go into degradation phase, and then as soon as you burn them, they immediately release their energy and other gases. Of course, this is going to produce some kind of gaseous waste, so it's still not ideal for what we want. The recycling economy is where a lot of people are thinking about cyclical nature of things. Many people in the tanning industry and in the luxury and brand industry think that they're in a circular economy and they're in what we call the recycling economy. So that's certainly something to consider. And what is the recycling economy? Well, first of all, you take materials from the biosphere, you make them into something, you use them during life, and of course, you then let them enter into this waste hierarchy where you're trying to get some kind of circular nature out of them. You recycle them or changing them back into production, back to the user, and recycling them around and around wherever you need to be. And then, of course, ultimately, they do end up in landfill to the biosphere as a waste product, and that can be quite a big problem. So we've still got a bin on the right-hand side there. We have to be very careful that we're not in the recycling economy when we think of the circular economy. And there's lots of people who are currently claiming circularity, and it's not. It's just straight recycling. And the point is there's waste at the end of it. So if you're recycling plastic, does that plastic ever end up in the bin? And for the majority of products that are so-called circular, they end up in the bin. So we've got to be careful of this. Now, Technosphere recycling is quite problematic. There are so many waste streams that we're trying to put into this kind of mindset. Generally, the market for these recyclables is not big enough. We know about China's complete ban of plastics entering into their country for recycling, and that's caused huge problems for a lot of Western economies. A lot of other countries have followed suit. So the markets for these recycled products are just not there. Of course, many of these products are contaminated. Some of them are composite materials. They are not just one straight type of polymer. And of course, that makes difficulties in trying to get it into a true recycling economy. The contamination is a huge issue. There's quite a few brands who are talking about taking ocean plastic and putting it into their final product. And I think they're understating just how difficult that is when it comes to, first of all, the mix, just how many different plastics there actually are and how much of them they scoop out and then have to throw away. But also just how is that plastic contaminated by being in the ocean for such a long period of time. Sea creatures grow on plastic, you're going to get difficulties from that kind of thing. The other major issue of Technosphere recycling is what we call legacy chemistry. And this is where the chemistry that was used sort of 50 years ago is now present in your material. And you're trying to put this through a circular loop, recycle it, and of course, reintroducing toxic chemistry, banned chemistry in some cases, back into your product. And you have to deal with that. So what we do see is lots of mislabeling, people trying to call it one thing and it's another thing. There are a lot of attempts to use green chemistry, hybridized plastics or hybridized materials, where you're trying to put some kind of biopolymer together with a petroleum-based product. And of course, this causes quite huge obstacles for the sector. The only way that we can do true Technosphere recycling with leather at the moment is to use it once as leather, and then to grind it down and to reformulate it as a leather fiber composite, and then continue to recycle it as you go on there. Now, the difficulty with all of that is, of course, the composite, whether it's a plastic composite or whether it's a leather composite. And what you do find happening is the polymer chains tend to shorten, and at some point, unless you're mixing it with virgin materials, at some point the material becomes unusable. This happens in paper, it happens in polyester, it happens in a range of other polymers, and it will be no different if we had to use leather fiber in this kind of fashion as well. At some point, we would have to dispose of the product because they would start failing performance. So this is an example of what we currently have. You have a car seat, and then you granulate it into fine dust or fibers, and then put it into a product, some kind of fiber sheet, backed, probably strengthened, maybe coated, and then placed into the same article, but of course as a composite. And hopefully you recycle this over time until eventually it reaches the end of its life and enters into the degradation phase. Now, many people would want to move out of this kind of ultimately going to end up in the dustbin. And the circular economy, I have placed the dustbin on this diagram, and that is because there's a little bit of confusion in the EU. The EU formal definition of the circular economy talks about minimization of waste. It doesn't talk about elimination of waste. And again, this is what caused a lot of confusion for many people. They've entered into the cycle where there's lots of arrows going around and around. The materials seem to be used to make something, and then this is held in almost an indefinite loop as you do things like reusing it, repairing it, recycling it back into use or production. The box at the top there, return. Some people would refer to this as remake. You could take a shoe at the end of its life, completely deconstruct it, and then remake it into another shoe. That would be the idea there. The focus in the EU is to minimize waste. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who are absolutely world leading in this area, they advocate no waste, absolutely no waste. And I think many people who are true environmentalists see circular economy as a waste-free way of doing business. So I've placed a dustbin there just to honor the European Commission's definition. But in principle, you would try to remove that dustbin completely, as you're going to see just a little bit later in the circular bioeconomy. Now, there are some examples. We don't do this very well. We have got the ability with leather to extend its life to have quite a long-lived product. And so, in principle, we could do remaking. And in this diagram, we show a car seat that gets retouched up or remade or repaired. And the long life ability of leather does allow this part of the circular economy to be something that we could do particularly well. We don't exploit it 100%. We are only talking about long life models. There's only been people going around the industry advocating this to brands and retailers. And it is part of the argument that we use to advocate sustainability of leather. The point of the circular economy is about efficiency. It's about making sure that you don't always have to invest energy and resource and time and people to make new products. You could take products that are existing already in the global arena and do something to them to keep them around. Of course, there are difficulties. There are some abilities for leather to find example here. We could repair leather very easily. It was not uncommon during medieval times that cobblers would take leather shoes, resole them, patch them, fix holes. And of course, leather has a beautiful property that it can be repaired in this manner. It doesn't fray. When it bursts, it can be resealed quite easily using patches. And so it could continue its life in this regard. We don't currently do any remanufacturing. We do some upcycling. We will be able to take leather waste from car seats or aircraft upholstery or buses, and we can make them into shoes and handbags, and that's currently being done. Remaking is not done. We don't ever take leather products, disassemble them, and then remake them into something identical or very similar. We don't do that. And again, this is an opportunity for leather manufacturers in the future to think of, is to try and get leather waste back from the end user and put it into the same object or something similar. The Technosphere circular economy is flawed at the moment. It doesn't merit enough longevity in the sustainability measurements. For example, if you're measuring carbon impact or environmental footprint, you generally say kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent or kilograms of whatever pollutants you're comparing per square meter of leather. What we need to be able to do in the future is say it's that much material per square meter divided by how many years it was actually in use. The number of years a product is in use must be rewarded if you're talking about sustainability, because something that is short-lived, even though it may have a very low impact, is going to need to be replaced by another short-lived product, and that's going to mount up quite quickly to be as polluting as something that lives for a very, very long time. So proponents in the industry talk about taking the impact per square meter and then dividing it by however many years it's going to be in use. If you throw it away after 1 month, that's still as bad as short-term product that would have been thrown away from that time anyway. In fact, you probably, if you were high impact, you would be making the situation even worse. Leather's environmental footprint is not too bad, and if you start dividing it by how many years it could be in service, it makes leather look extremely sustainable in a circular economy model. Unfortunately, Technosphere carbon circular economy does not offer a very nice growth financial model. So many brands and retailers look at long life models and think, well, how the hell are we going to get return on investment for our shareholders? But there are some things that you could actually do to get there. Okay, so talking a little bit about the Technosphere circular economy growth model and how this could be something that brands could engage with when it comes to leather. Of course, it's not easy for some of the brands and retailers that don't do any manufacturing, but many of their companies may be pushed into acquisition of manufacturing companies to help with a model that could include longevity. So, for example, the second-hand handbag market, some of the second-hand leather clothing, and of course, second-hand leather upholstery, books, and other types of leather products. These are products really well suited to long-life models. They are currently in business. Many small companies do these second-hand features, and it's something that millennials and Gen Z seem to be really engaging with. This seems to be one of the fastest-growing economic trends is the reuse and repair and recycling of things. So leather fits really well into that. The difficulty is, as you can see a couple of points down, is intimate clothing, particularly when it comes to the whole shoe. You will have issues with hygiene. You will have issues that downstream owners are thinking that it may just be a little bit unhygienic to engage with. But that doesn't mean that we could remove the upper, take the lining out and reline them and put them back into the next generation of shoe. This is something that some of the big English dress shoemakers in Northamptonshire do. They will allow people to buy previously owned shoes on eBay and then allow them to be brought into their factories for resoling and further use as a shoe. So there could be ways around it. I don't think things like gloving, leather trousers, or other types of really intimate kind of clothing will be things that could fit into this. And what this will happen in terms of growth, economic growth, is it will allow the startup of small leather repair companies and remaking companies who may provide interesting ways forward for brands and retailers. The last point that I would just like to make on the way that brands could engage with circular economy growth models is, of course, acquiring some of these small companies that are doing these things that are listed above quite well. So if a big brand wanted to engage with a long life product such as leather, it could acquire small companies that do the current long life model quite well, and of course it seems that millennials and Gen Z are quite happy not to own materials, rent materials, reuse materials, make sure that they get remade and repaired. And so this is something that what we may see in the future is either brands becoming smaller or looking to how small companies do it and being firmly in the technosphere, in the human world. And so what we need to understand is that you're going to have technosphere, or the circular economy as many people are referring to it as. And then, of course, on the left-hand side, we have this bioeconomy or the biosphere. And what we mean by circular bioeconomy is the overlap between these two worlds, is the material either being in the circular economy or being on the left-hand side in the bioeconomy. Okay, so the circular bioeconomy, not that old. It's probably only been spoken about over the last sort of 6 to 8 months, but many people in waste hierarchy circles, waste industry, are talking about the circular bioeconomy as being the answer to our particular problems. Fundamentally, it is a circular model, same as the one that I've shown before, but at the top left you can see green part of the screen. Yes, there's lots of symbolism there. It's supposed to be more eco-friendly. And when we return materials back or recycle, or we get to the making phase and the produced materials think that it's no longer going to be able to go in a circular economy, they will allow it to enter back into the bioeconomy or the biosphere. And in the biosphere, the material is broken back down to its elemental components, and those elemental components are going to be what nature remakes into the resources that we will then be able to take and place back into our manufacturing cycle. So it's now an overlap between natural carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur cycles that go into being made into biomaterials, and those biomaterials we will then take and put into our manufactured product and allow them to be in the technosphere for as long as we think they should be. It's very important to note that these materials entering into the circular bioeconomy are natural materials. They cannot be synthetic materials or petrochemical-based materials. Those products do not have any place in the circular bioeconomy because you cannot return them back to the biosphere elementally to continue their journey as something that nature can use. We'll maybe expand that on another webinar at a later stage. So in this last slide here, we can see the natural carbon cycle that takes place on Earth at the moment. We can see that carbon is cycled through, first of all, capture of sunlight energy together with carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that, of course, is stored in plants. Grasses and trees, the carbon is going to be stored in this form. Animals will eat this carbon, and of course they will change it into tissues, which we are going to be eating. And of course the byproducts that come out of the meat industry, like leather, will be cycled through the technosphere until it reaches a point where we no longer need it. We can then take that leather, and if it is biodegradable, we can allow it to go back into the biosphere, where of course it'll continue in what we would term more of the natural carbon cycle, something that's quite short-lived. Of course, what is not helping humans is the release of deep carbon, the fossil carbon that we've had removed from the atmosphere millions of years ago, placed into fossil fuels. If we have to use those kinds of carbon sources in addition to the carbon that leather provides, we're going to get this issue where, of course, we're still going to see increasing carbon levels, in the atmosphere, which ultimately is going to contribute to climate change. And so proponents of the circular bioeconomy are saying if we can skip out the fossil fuels, and if we can have leather, first of all, as a source of trapping carbon, but secondly, as a way of short-lived carbon in a growth model, something that doesn't impact the environment, something that uses biological source carbon in the form of a renewable hide and skin, and allow it to live as long as it wants to in the technosphere. But ultimately, if it needs to, it could go back into the biosphere, where it can continue with a short-lived natural cycle. If we can be in that position, many people believe that the environment will be in a healthier state.
Thank you, Karl. Another highly interesting topic. You can post a question to any of the presenters using the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. Those that are not covered today will be forwarded to them to respond to you. So let's begin by asking our presenters some questions. Michael, can you give further examples of how waste from the leather making process or from other industrial processes can be used to make leather a more circular material?
Well, I think I mentioned a few of them in this presentation briefly. Many of the waste products from the early part of leather manufacturing can be reused and reintroduced into other industries, especially if they can be converted into collagen protein that is useful. So that can happen in the early stages of leather manufacture. Shavings and trimmings have also been proven to be able to be reused in similar articles like shoes and garments. So you can actually chop up waste or trimmings and shavings, use special chemistry to make them into another product, which is not leather, but it's based on waste of leather. And that can potentially, and indeed commercially, it is already being used in some articles related to footwear and garments. So there's many possibilities here. But this is where a lot of focus is also being directed by the research institutes and by the chemical companies. What more can we do to make it even more circular? And there's many ideas on this already floating around. But indeed, there's already a lot going on, which is very positive. Maybe we don't sell that enough, and maybe it's not known enough. But there is indeed a considerable amount of circularity already built into the leather process. Yeah?
Great, thank you. The next question. Does the chemical technology already exist today for leather to be made to last for its intended product lifetime of, say, 3 or 5 years, for example, and then to be fully compostable at its end of life without further processing?
Yeah, 3 to 5 years is quite short, I think. We'd like to think that leather can last much more than that. But I think your question is more about whether a technology exists that such that at the end of its life, there could be some magic trigger that makes it compostable and biodegradable. And I'd say the answer to that is not quite. However, the way that you manufacture and process the leather and the chemicals that you use during the process has a strong influence on the ability of that final leather to compost and biodegrade. I'll give an example. A leather that is very highly finished with a high amount of polyurethane finish, which may be required for certain types of applications, for example, automotive as an example, then that leather is likely to biodegrade, but the coating on the top will not biodegrade at the same rate as the leather underneath. So in many biodegradation studies, you can see that in those cases, there's a film of coating that's left behind while the rest of the leather composts and breaks down. However, if you produce leather in a way that does not require so much finishing or so much stabilization, depending on the kind of finished article you want, then you can get different levels of compostability and biodegradability. This depends on the design of the leather, the design of the chemicals, of course. But what you've asked me is for this magic solution, and that's not quite ready yet, I think, but we're working on it. I think it's something that the chemical industry is aware of and working on, is that if there would be some magical way to suddenly trigger the composting and degradation of the leather when it is required at the end of its life. One of the difficulties here is, of course, that leather is designed to last a long time. So how do we make it last a long time? Well, we make it as stable and strong as possible while retaining its natural appearance. That goes against a little bit the idea of suddenly breaking down and biodegrading. But I think there is technology, surely there must be technology out there that we could investigate more to see if there was some combination of how we could trigger this composting at the end of its life. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting area for the future, and we're working on it. Yeah.
Right, so there's plenty of solutions in development. Right, final question. You mentioned that leather has good longevity in use. Are there certain types of leather and leather processes where the product shelf life lasts for a longer period?
Yes, there are certain types of leather and processes where it can be designed to last longer. Vegetable tanned leather is an example. Generally, it produces a much harder leather, which is more stable and lasts a longer time. They've found veg tanned leather from thousands of years ago buried in the ground and preserved and in pretty good shape, and that is partly because of the way that it was tanned in such a stable way. So indeed, what determines the lifetime of the leather is the type of leather, first of all, the animal, but more than anything, the process and the chemistry that's employed during the tanning steps and retannage and finishing. Those are the steps in the process that determine the life of the leather in the process. So yes, that's true.
Right, well, thank you very much, Michael. Fabiana, can you tell us a little bit more about UNIC's investment in Cicit and what extra benefits the tanning industry may gain from the investment in the future?
The acquisition of stakes in Cicit is a clear proof of UNIC Group confidence in the future of the sector and is fully part of the strategic objectives of the association. The future of the tanning industry is and will be based on continuous investment on sustainability, recycling activities, circular economy, not only made directly by tanneries and other supply chain operators, but mostly in Italy, also in the framework of cooperative entities like trade associations and consortium working for the sector. UNIC has always been active and highly focused on this concern. The specific investment made by us, that is 2% of the whole stakes value, represents an important endorsement to the green business model of Cicit, a company that has been considered for years as an example of excellence in the leather industry at global level.
Great, thank you. What is your position on metal-free tanning systems and how they may work in a circular system?
It's a good question. Does their experience tell us that every technology of tanning has its advantages and disadvantages? At the moment, comparing chrome and major chrome-free tanning alternatives, there is not a technology that is more sustainable on the base of all indicators of environmental impact. Chromium bath, for example, can be recovered. Other exhaustive bath cannot. Furthermore, to obtain the same performances of materials tanned with chrome-free technology, a higher quantity of chemicals needs, with an increasing of pollution of the wastewater, for example. In our opinion, circularity is a question of efficiency and manufacture practices of the entire production process. It is misleading to focus only on the tanning technology, not considering the global impact of the production process.
Okay, great, thank you. Can you tell us more about how companies can find used finished leathers for potential upcycling applications? Are there sources in Italy where this type of leather is collected and prepared for reuse?
In Italy, there are some interesting cases of leather reusage. One is Regenesi, that creates a selection of accessories made from Dainese leather suits, for example. Dainese is a brand of motorcycle racing gear. If shredded, finished leather can be used for different applications, such as non-woven tissue, for example. This is the case of Sagitta and Maprotec, that are two Italian companies. Finally, there are some charity companies that can disassemble unsold articles to obtain materials usable to create new articles, or small craft firms that create fashion and artistic articles from leather scraps. Unfortunately, nowadays, the main problem for the industrialization of recovery practices of the articles when they are at the end of their life are costs, because they are still too high.
Great. Thank you so much, Fabiana. Karl, how far are we in time and technology from a completely biodegradable leather?
Time-wise, we're certainly already there. We have tested quite a few leathers already that have a biodegradability that's less than 30 days. We know that there are already leathers that are fully biodegradable and have been for the last 200, 300 years, certainly when it comes to the definition of biodegradability. When it comes to technology, are we fully there? I would say that there's only about 10% of leathers globally that would pass a biodegradability test, particularly ISO 2200, which is a 90-day breakdown. However, 100% of all leathers globally, I would say, able to pass a degradability test. Remember, the difference between biodegradability and degradability is that in biodegradability, you need bacteria and fungi as your reason for the breakdown, whereas degradability could use oxygen, water, acid, whatever. If a product develops acidity during its life, it will digest itself, as is in the case of some of the vegetable tan leathers. They eat themselves away over time. So technology-wise, there's some tanneries that are already doing some fantastic things to ensure that their leathers are biodegradable going forward.
Great, thank you. Right. What advantages does leather have over other materials in a circular system?
Good question. Well, first of all, if we want to take it one step further than just the circular economy model, we look at the circular bioeconomy model, and that's where leather really stands out from other materials. Leather is carbon-based. That's a fundamental requirement for the bioeconomic model. The second thing is leather is long-lived. So in essence, in the Technosphere, it's going to be a circular kind of material that could be reused, repaired, remade. It comes from a renewable source. So as long as people eat meat, we are going to have this material. We don't have to grow it. We don't have to synthesize it in a factory somewhere. It's going to be a starting material that's going to come out from another industry, and that makes it highly renewable. And then, of course, labeled correctly, leather could be the material that manufacturers are looking for, because they know through life cycle that it could easily fit into a circular bioeconomy. So from a perspective, it's a fantastic material in that regard.
Great. And final question. Are there any examples that exist of where leather is used in one of the circular models you described in your presentation?
In terms of circular economy, there's examples which I'll get onto in a second. Some people would say that there could even be a circularity nature associated with what they would term the linear economy. And if you think of the end-of-life vehicle directive, the EU commitment is that automakers must recycle as much of their materials going into their cars. But in 2015, they allowed some of that recycling to be in the form of energy. If you take a material that is going to be burnt into energy as bioenergy, then you could count that as recycling as such. So even though it's in a linear model, it is still going to be circular in some instances. And the end-of-life vehicle directive certainly takes that into account. So most of the automotive leathers will certainly fall into that particular category. If we look at the recycling economy, here we're going to have a situation where the only way that we can recycle leathers in its current capacity is through composites. So here you would need to take the leather, place it into fiber, and then place it into a composite material that's back or surface coated to get it to perform as a material. And there are examples in shoes, handbags, and in upholstery where this is the case. Very often companies will take shavings. I don't think there are any companies at the moment who take leather fiber from disintegrated leather and do that. There are some difficulties technically when it comes to fiber that contains surface coating or fiber that contains retannages. But at the moment, shavings is certainly something that is composited and placed back into other materials. When it comes to what most people would term as circular economy, there are some examples as per the EU definition where they are long-lived or held in circularity for quite a long time, but at some point in their life, they will maybe enter into the waste stream, or elements will enter the waste stream. In terms of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, there are no leather materials that will generate no waste in their life. And I think any other material that claims that they're in true circularity by Ellen MacArthur Foundation definition, I think if they're claiming that, they're probably misleading people. If we look at circular bioeconomy, we certainly see the aldehyde tanned leathers being the type of tannage that, together with new generation tannages, those types of leathers are certainly leathers that have no impact when they enter back into the biosphere. They will enter a compost environment or go back into soil remediation quite comfortably. with very, very little impact in terms of the environment. So they are already there. They're truly able to be leathers that can claim circular bioeconomic status. Unfortunately, the metal tannages, when they go into a compost scenario, the metals tend to aggregate, and if you put them into soil, you start increasing the metal levels of the soil. So from an ecotox perspective, you might struggle to get soil quality standards. Not impossible, but it'll be difficult. So the metal tannages are something that would struggle at this particular stage to claim circular bioeconomic state. So from that perspective, there are already a lot of examples, and I'm currently working with about 5 companies that are certainly at that stage where they can claim full circular bioeconomic status.
Very interesting, thank you. I would like to conclude the webinar today by thanking our 3 excellent presenters for sharing their knowledge and insight on this topic. I would also like to thank Stahl once again for sponsoring the webinar, and we will be posting the full webinar online soon in case there were any aspects you would like to see again. A link to the recording will be also sent out. Finally, you will now be asked a short survey about the webinar today to provide feedback so that we can make sure we are offering content that is of genuine interest. ILM will be hosting more free-to-view webinars over the coming months, so keep an eye out for future topics on the ILM website. Our contact details can be seen on the screen in front of you. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.